Delegate Marin Solis stood at the smallest podium in the chamber and felt the weight of 31 civilizations pressing down on her from every direction. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, literally. The ceiling above her arched so high it disappeared into a haze of refracted light, a living crystalline structure that pulsed faintly as if it were breathing. Every word spoken beneath it would be recorded, preserved, carried forward long after the speakers themselves had turned to dust. The floor was a mirror of black stone, polished past the point of reflection. It didn't just return shapes, it returned presence, turning every delegate into something doubled, diminished, and strangely unreal. The chamber had been built to remind everyone how small they were. Solis knew that now in a way she hadn't when she first walked into it 14 sessions ago. She had understood it intellectually. The scale, the intention behind the architecture, the message embedded in every surface. But understanding something and feeling it were two different things, and standing here now, with the vote still hours away and 31 species arranged in tiered silence above her, she felt it in her chest like a slow current she couldn't stop. Her hands were relaxed at her sides. Her face was composed in the careful stillness she had spent years building. Not the stillness of someone who felt nothing, but the stillness of someone who had learned that the smallest visible fracture could be interpreted, recorded, weaponized. She had watched rooms like this consume people who showed too much. Rooms where being human meant being watched for exactly the kinds of reactions that could become leverage. So she stood still, and she observed. Tiered seating rose upward in a slow curve, filled with beings who did not need to speak to make their presence known. Some sat in towering forms of chitin and crystal, their bodies massive and ancient and utterly composed. Others floated in containment fields, luminous gas swirling in controlled patterns that suggested faces or something in place of faces. A few resembled something close enough to human that it felt uncomfortable to look at them for too long, not because of what they were, but because of the reminder of what that resemblance meant, how young it made her feel, how approximate. Earth's podium was smaller, plainer, newer. It didn't carry the weight of centuries. It didn't carry anything at all. Earth had been part of the Council for 43 years. 43 years against histories measured in millennia. The youngest species in the chamber by more than a factor of 10. Some of the beings seated above her came from civilizations that had been building cities before humans had discovered agriculture. Their minor disputes referenced events that had happened before Earth had written its first recorded language. Their alliances had been forged and broken and reforged across spans of time that dwarfed the entire arc of human civilization. Earth, by comparison, was a recent inconvenience. She had spent years learning how to exist here anyway, learning the language and the pauses and the unspoken hierarchies that determined who was truly heard and who was merely tolerated. She had learned when to speak and when silence was the loudest statement she could make. She had made herself useful. She had made herself careful. She had made herself, if not equal, then at least present, a voice that the room had slowly, grudgingly learned to acknowledge. She let her eyes move across the chamber now. Some watched her openly. Others did not bother to look at all. A few observed through projection, their images shimmering at the edges, distant but no less involved. The species she had considered something close to neutral, not friends, but not enemies either, had begun to turn their attention elsewhere in the days leading up to this session. Meetings had been canceled, communications delayed, requests for discussion quietly declined. Not hostility, something worse, distance. The particular kind of distance that forms around something already decided. She thought of a word she had come across in the Council's 6,000 years of archived proceedings. A word that had appeared and reappeared across dozens of cases, always in the same context, always used in the same tone of regret that wasn't quite regret. Inevitable. This was how they made things inevitable. Not with force, with architecture, with procedure, with the slow, careful repositioning of everyone around a conclusion that had already been reached somewhere behind closed doors, so that when it was finally announced in the open, it simply looked like consensus. She had stood in this chamber 14 times before. She had never felt smaller than she did now. Not because of the ceiling, not because of the other delegates, but because, for the first time since Earth had taken its seat among them, she understood exactly what was happening. And she understood, with a clarity that settled in her chest like cold stone, that understanding it was not the same as being able to stop it. This was not a room built for equals, and Earth had never truly been one of them. 11 weeks earlier, she had been sitting in a government briefing room on the third floor of a building she'd spent half her career working in, reading a report that had been passed to her through 4 different hands before it reached hers. The report had been filed by a Dr. Yuki Adami, 29 years old, a xenobiological researcher who had been assigned to a survey vessel operating in a licensed extraction zone, a strip of unremarkable space, barely worth naming. The kind of place the Council's systems had processed and categorized and moved past 1,000 times. The kind of place no one paid attention to unless there was profit buried under the surface. There usually was. The crew hadn't expected to find anything else. The initial scans had been ordinary. Biological activity, yes, but simple, unstructured. The Council's classification systems had a word for it, a word that functioned as efficiently as a door being closed: non-sentient. It meant the drills could keep running. It meant no one had to ask further questions. It meant the decision had already been made long before anyone bothered to look closely. But Adami had looked anyway. She had spent those 11 weeks in a cave system carved into the interior of a moon that should have been empty. It wasn't. What she found didn't speak. Not in sound, not in light, not in anything the Council's systems were designed to recognize. The life form, a colony organism, distributed across the cave walls in structures that looked like mineral deposits until you understood what you were looking at, communicated through contact, through chains of chemical signals passed organism to organism, encoding not just information but experience. Memory itself, transferred through touch and proximity in ways that no standard cognition test had been designed to measure. No tools, no voices, no structures that resembled intention if you were looking for intention the way the Council defined it. And yet when she lay on the cave floor with sensors pressed against her skin, she felt something answering back. Not random, not instinct, curiosity. She wrote in her notes that night, and Solis had read those notes, had read all of it, every page of the supplementary record, that the answering back felt like being noticed. Like something very old and very patient had turned a portion of its attention toward her and found her interesting. It took weeks before she could respond in a way that made sense to them. Longer still before she understood that what they were sharing with her wasn't just information. It was history. Their history, layered and living, stored within the structure of the colony itself the way memory is stored in bone. When she finally managed to hold a full exchange, it lasted 4 hours, and she never described all of it. Only that they had shown her something at the end. A memory carried at the edges of the colony like a scar. The sound of drilling. The vibration of machines tearing into the rock above them. The slow, relentless approach of something that didn't know they were there, and she understood this. She wrote it plainly. Wouldn't have stopped if it did. She filed her report. So did the ship. A formal complaint, submitted through proper channels, citing the confirmed presence of a sentient species in an active extraction zone, requesting immediate review, immediate intervention. By every principle the Council claimed to uphold, the process should have been straightforward: identify, reclassify, stop the damage. That was the system. That was what humanity had been told the system was when they joined it 43 years ago. That was what Solis had believed. The response came back in 48 hours. Not a review, not an investigation, a dismissal. The contact, they said, had been unauthorized. The classification, they said, remained unchanged. The complaint, they said, was invalid at the point of origin. 48 hours. Solis had read that detail 3 times when it first arrived, feeling the wrongness of it the way you feel the wrongness of a step that isn't where the floor should be. The Council's standard review process took months just to acknowledge receipt. A full dismissal, one that should have required cross-species consultation, independent verification, layers of oversight, had arrived clean and final in less than 2 days. Because it had already been decided. She spent the weeks that followed reading everything she could access, pulling records that weren't designed to be read together, following threads that didn't officially connect. The Council's systems weren't designed to hide information. They were designed to bury it, and buried things, if you were patient enough, could still be found. The corporation operating in the extraction zone had a perfect compliance history. Licensing fees paid on time. No prior violations. Consistent output. The kind of partner the Council preferred. Predictable, profitable, easy to justify. But buried inside the licensing agreements were secondary attachments, cross-species trade deals, resource-sharing contracts, arrangements that didn't violate any rule individually, but together formed something else entirely. The Ethics and Classification Review Board, the one that had dismissed the complaint in 48 hours, was chaired by a species that held 17 active commercial agreements with that same corporation. Not illegal, not even technically a conflict of interest under the definitions the council used. Just aligned. She had stared at that detail for a long time. The way you stare at something you already understand but need a moment to fully accept. She had requested clarification through proper channels. The response came back polite, immediate, and empty. No conflict of interest had been identified. The system had reviewed itself and found no fault. Of course not. She kept digging. Historical cases. Prior reclassifications. Disputes raised and quietly resolved. Patterns began to emerge the longer she looked. Not identical, not obvious, but consistent enough to feel intentional. Species discovered in resource-rich zones that failed initial cognition tests. Appeals filed. Delays introduced. Classifications upheld. Extraction continued. Always within the rules. Always explained in language so precise it left no space for argument. And always, somewhere in the background, there were agreements. Contracts. Relationships that ensured the outcome remained stable. Predictable. Profitable. Undisturbed. She had brought what she found to the council. Not as an accusation. She understood that much about how to survive in this room. She framed it as a question. Carefully documented. Impossible to dismiss outright without at least acknowledging the connections she'd drawn. They acknowledged them. And then they moved on. The agreements, they said, were standard. The processes, they said, were functioning as intended. The classifications, they said, were based on established criteria. Nothing she had presented violated the system, which meant the system itself could not be at fault. It was a perfect structure. Closed. Self-reinforcing. Immune to the kind of truth that didn't fit inside its own definitions. And standing in this chamber now, watching delegates who had once at least looked in her direction turn their attention elsewhere, Solis felt the full shape of the thing she had been walking inside without fully seeing. This was never about a misclassification. It was never about a procedural error. The species beneath that cave floor, the ones who remembered the sound of drilling, who had shown a young researcher their oldest scar, didn't matter because they weren't recognized. And humanity didn't matter anymore because they had chosen to recognize them anyway. The system wasn't broken. It was working exactly as designed. The vote took 11 minutes. There were procedures, of course. There were always procedures. Motions introduced, language verified, confirmations requested in the precise, ritualized order that made the outcome feel not like a decision, but like an inevitability unfolding exactly as it was meant to. The chamber's crystalline ceiling pulsed gently with each recorded statement, preserving everything, as it always did, because the room had been built for exactly this. The preservation of moments that would long outlast the beings who made them. Solis stood at her podium and listened as each delegate cast their vote. One by one. Calm. Measured. Detached. 31 voices speaking in different tones, different frequencies, different languages, all translated into the same neutral cadence that stripped away anything resembling emotion. In favor. In favor. In favor. There was no hesitation. No visible doubt. No sign that any of them paused, even for a moment, to consider another outcome. Earth's vote did not come. Suspended members lost their voting rights the moment the motion was called. A procedural detail buried deep enough in the council's framework that it rarely mattered. Until now, 30 votes were recorded, 30 in favor of suspension. The final confirmation carried perfectly through a chamber designed to hold exactly these moments forever. Earth's membership in the Council of Worlds is hereby suspended. Trade access, revoked. Communication relays, suspended. Shared infrastructure agreements, paused. A formal review hearing, scheduled. 40 years from today. 40. The number settled in her chest like something falling through water. Not the sharp impact of a blow. Something slower, colder. 40 years. She was 38 years old. She would be 78 years old at the review hearing. If she lived that long, if the review hearing ever actually happened, if it meant anything when it did. The colonies scattered across 14 systems would spend 40 years cut off from routes they had never had to think about, from medicines they didn't know how to produce, from supply chains so deeply woven into daily life that most people had stopped being able to see them at all. Not an attack, an absence, a door closing, and everything on the other side becoming unreachable. She did not react, not outwardly. She had trained for this, not for this exact moment, but for the category of moment it belonged to. Rooms where reaction was weakness. Rooms where the smallest visible fracture would be interpreted and recorded and remembered. So she stood still, hands loose at her sides, face composed, breathing steady. Around her, the chamber resumed its quiet continuation of order. Delegates shifted slightly in their seats. Some had already turned their attention elsewhere, as if the matter had been resolved at the moment the final vote was cast. Because for them, it had. This was procedure, necessary correction, a minor adjustment to maintain order in systems that had run for 6,000 years. Then, from somewhere behind her, so small it was almost nothing, a sound. One of her staff, quickly suppressed, almost not there. The sound of someone who had not yet learned to hold still inside a room that required it. Solis didn't turn. She became aware of the fact that she was still allowed one thing. A statement. Protocol granted a suspended delegate a final remark before the session closed. A formality, more than anything else. A controlled outlet designed to let the expelled speak their piece into the record before the record moved on without them. It changed nothing. Everyone in the chamber knew it changed nothing. She stepped slightly closer to the receiver. The chamber went quiet, not from respect, but because the system required it. 31 civilizations, some of the oldest in the known galaxy, arranged in tiers above her, waiting with the patient composure of beings who had sat through thousands of these and would sit through thousands more. She looked out at them for a moment, not at any one of them, at all of them. Then, in a voice that was level and precise and entirely unshaken, "What do you call a species," she said, "that develops language you cannot hear?" No one answered. No one moved. The ceiling pulsed softly, recording. She let the silence sit. One breath. Two. Long enough for it to stop being a pause and start being something else, something that pressed against the walls and rose into that distant crystalline haze and stayed there. Long enough to be the loudest thing that had happened in this chamber in a very long time. Then she gathered her materials, turned, and walked out. Behind her, the chamber resumed its quiet continuation of order, unhurried and unchanged, as it always had. Ahead of her was only the distance between here and home, and the knowledge that when she arrived, the world she returned to would already be changing. The message took less than 10 seconds to write. It took longer to decide to send it. Solis sat alone in the small communications room at the rear of the ship, the door sealed, the sounds of departure checks reduced to a distant vibration through the hall. The console in front of her glowed softly in the dark, waiting. 6 hours until the relay network cut them off completely. Less now, with every minute she sat here not writing. She had reports to file, summaries to prepare, a full account of the council session formatted in the careful language of diplomacy that translated catastrophe into something manageable and filed it where people who needed to feel that things were manageable could find it. She didn't open those files. Instead, she pulled up a direct channel. Admiral Yara Oae, not the most senior official she could contact, not the closest ally she had in the strict sense, but the one person she knew would understand without explanation, who would read between the words the way you can only read between words when years of shared data and shared conclusions have built a kind of shorthand that doesn't require spelling out. There are different kinds of trust. Friendship is one. This was something else. She rested her fingers lightly against the console. For a moment she did nothing. Not because she was unsure. She wasn't. Because she understood exactly what this meant. Once the message was sent, there would be no space left for the possibility that things might still be contained. No room for the quieter hope that some mechanism she hadn't found yet might still change the outcome. This would define what came after. She typed 2 words. She read them once. She sent it. On Earth, it was the middle of the night when it arrived. Admiral Oae was awake. She was often awake at this hour, working through maintenance reports at her desk, the kind of work that filled time without demanding too much of it. Her office was quiet. Through the window, the planet turned slowly below, city lights tracing the curve of continents against the dark. The notification appeared. Priority channel. Direct. She opened it. 2 words. It's done. She read them. Set the device down. Picked up her coffee. Drank what remained, cold. Then she opened the bottom drawer of her desk and reached beneath the standard reports and archived briefings and the quiet accumulation of years and found what she had kept there for 9 years. A physical folder, worn slightly at the edges, labeled in her own handwriting. Contingency 7. She opened it. The first page contained a single line, written 2 decades earlier by a strategist who had spent a career studying scenarios most people preferred not to think about. If they ever make us leave, make sure leaving was their mistake. OAE looked at the words for a long moment. They felt different now, less theoretical, like something that had always been waiting to become real and had just received permission. She closed the folder, set it on the desk, reached for the comm. The first call woke a shipyard supervisor who hadn't expected to be needed until morning. The second reached a logistics coordinator who had been tracking supply chains that no longer existed. The third went to a research lead who had been working on problems that were suddenly not optional anymore. One by one, systems that had been sitting idle shifted. Not into panic, into motion. The particular kind of motion that looks almost like any other kind of work until you understand what it's building toward. Outside, the first edge of dawn began to touch the horizon. Inside, OAE made the final call. "We're initiating contingency," she said. She paused, just long enough for the words to settle into the person on the other end. Then, more quietly, full implementation. The first thing to run out wasn't food. It wasn't fuel. It wasn't even time. It was assumption. For 43 years, humanity had operated inside a system that worked so smoothly most people had stopped thinking about it. Ships arrived when they were scheduled. Supplies moved where they were needed. Medicines appeared in hospitals with labels written in languages no one on Earth actually spoke, but everyone trusted because the system had always provided them and always would. It had never felt fragile. Until it stopped. The relay network went dark exactly 6 hours after the vote. One moment the system showed green, routes active, signals clear, connections intact. The next, it didn't. No transition, no warning, just absence. Across Earth and its 14 colonies, systems designed to expect continuity encountered silence instead. Orders failed to process. Requests returned nothing. Automated supply chains paused, waited, and then halted entirely. At first it looked like a delay. Then it started to look like something else. The reports began arriving within days. Not dramatic at first. Not catastrophic. Just gaps. 43 medical treatments used daily across Earth's hospitals had been built on synthesis processes licensed through council networks. Without access to those licenses, production systems couldn't verify their own protocols, which meant they didn't run. Stockpiles covered the first wave, weeks in some cases, days in others. 8 days after the ban, Admiral OAE received the full report. She read it completely, without interruption, without visible reaction. Then she forwarded it to 6 people with a message attached that was short enough to read in a single breath. Priority 1. Don't come back with problems. Come back with a plan. They did. Not immediately. Not easily. The first viable proposal came from a biochemist named Lena Park who had spent the better part of a decade studying synthesis processes as a theoretical exercise, mapping them down to first principles in case the original data was ever unavailable. She had presented this work at conferences to polite attention and modest funding and the general assumption that it was the kind of research that was interesting without being necessary. Now it was necessary. The plan was simple in concept and staggering in execution. Rebuild everything from scratch. Not copy. Not replicate. Understand each process well enough to recreate it without the original permissions. It violated multiple council patents. It bypassed agreements humanity had signed when they joined the system. By every formal definition, it was illegal. OAE sent it to legal review. The response came back in 4 hours. Technically, yes, but they'd have to show up to enforce it. She read that once, then sent the order, start synthesis. That was how the first months went. Not with speeches, not with declarations, with work. Relentless, unremarkable, necessary work. Teams formed across disciplines that had never interacted before. Chemists working alongside engineers, logistics specialists coordinating with researchers who had never thought of themselves as essential. Shipyards reevaluating designs that had always relied on external infrastructure they no longer had access to. Every problem followed the same pattern. Identify the dependency, determine whether it could be replaced, decide how much time they had before it became critical, and then solve it. Or fail trying. There was no fallback, no external support, no one to ask. Every solution had to come from inside. And this, OAE found herself thinking in the quieter moments. This was the thing the council had not considered when it made its decision. That cutting off access to everything would also mean cutting off the subtle dependency that came with access. That people who can no longer rely on a system are people who have no choice but to become something the system didn't expect. The colonies were the immediate focus. 14 worlds scattered across distances that had always been manageable because the routes between them had been maintained by something larger than humanity alone. Without relay-assisted navigation, those distances became what they had always truly been: time. Weeks of it. Months. The first ships that left Earth after the blackout weren't impressive. They weren't fast or elegant. They were built to carry as much as possible, as reliably as possible, across distances that had suddenly grown very large. Wide-bodied cargo vessels with oversized fuel reserves, stripped interiors, systems designed for endurance over efficiency. The crews called them mules. Not because it sounded good, because it was accurate. They carried everything. And they kept going. The first convoy, 12 ships, all volunteer crews, took 9 weeks longer than the same route would have taken under council infrastructure. Navigation was slower, riskier, based on incomplete data and educated judgment. There were no relays to correct mistakes, no automated systems to adjust course, just crews making decisions in stretches of space that hadn't been mapped in detail because no one had ever needed to. Before the convoy launched, OAE spoke to the commanders. She didn't give them a speech, didn't try to inspire them, didn't pretend this was anything other than exactly what it was. The colonies need what you're carrying, she said. You won't have communication on the long stretches. You'll be making decisions without support. She paused. Then, more quietly, I need you to come back. No one asked how. No one asked if. They understood the request. The ships launched. And somewhere along those routes, slow, uncertain, stretching across space that no longer felt connected in the way it once had, humanity started to change. Not all at once. Not in any way that could be named in the moment, but in the accumulation of small decisions made without external validation, in the willingness to move forward without permission, in the quiet acceptance that the systems they had relied on were gone, and that the people who had taken them away had not expected what would grow in the space left behind. The signal wasn't meant for them. That was the first thing Petrovas noticed when it appeared on her console at the start of the second month of the run, a standard distress frequency, repeating at precise intervals, tagged in a format that belonged to a network Earth no longer had access to. Under normal circumstances, it would have been routed automatically, handled by systems designed to respond faster than any human could. Now it just sat there, a signal in the dark, waiting for someone who was supposed to be listening. The bridge of the Dogged was quiet, her crew moving with the careful focus of people who had learned quickly that hesitation cost time they didn't have. 3 weeks into their first run, 3 weeks of long routes, partial maps, and the kind of navigation that relied more on judgment than certainty. They had already lost contact with one of the trailing ships for 6 hours in a region no survey had properly charted. It had reappeared intact, but the silence of those 6 hours had left a residue that hadn't quite lifted. Now this, not ours, someone said from the back of the bridge. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a fact. Voss knew that. She also knew exactly what was sitting in her cargo hold. Medical supplies, food, equipment, everything a colony 3 weeks ahead of them needed. Every hour of delay was an hour of distance from something that couldn't wait. The signal repeated. Steady, persistent. Someone somewhere was waiting for an answer that wasn't coming. Voss exhaled slowly. Patch it through. The being on the other side of the visual link did not look human. Tall, angular, covered in dark feather-like structures that caught the light in sharp ridges along the shoulders and crown. Its eyes were bright and steady, set in a face that ended in something like a beak, designed for a world built on different rules. Behind it, the interior of the ship was dim. Minimal power. Not stable. The translator aligned. This is civilian transport vessel under distress. Drive component failure. Requesting assistance. No urgency in the voice. No desperation. Just the statement. delivered with the composure of someone who had already accepted that the outcome was likely to be no. Voss leaned forward slightly. How bad? Data transferred across the link. Her systems parsed it. Bad enough. Fixable, but not without parts they clearly didn't carry. You're off the main routes, Voss said. Yes. You know we're not council. A pause. I know. Another pause, longer. Then, without emphasis, without bitterness. We have been turned away before. Voss looked at her navigation display. The route ahead. The margin, already thin, already carrying the weight of 9 weeks of difficult math. Then she looked back at the screen. Do you need food or fuel first? She asked. The being blinked. Not confusion. Something that looked like it was deciding whether to trust the question. I need the drive component. You'll get it, Voss said. But it's going to take a few hours to fabricate. While we do that, food or fuel? A long pause. Fuel. Done. She was already turning to her crew. Transfer fuel. Engineering. You're building a component. No one argued. No one asked whether this was the right call. They had all read the same reports coming out of the suspended colonies. They all knew what it meant to be sitting in a dead ship in empty space waiting for someone to decide you mattered enough to stop. The docking process took longer than usual. 2 ships in a stretch of space that wasn't built for cooperation, aligning carefully, systems syncing just enough to allow transfer without risking failure on either side. For 4 hours they stayed like that. Connected. Working. The engineer, Mira, handled the fabrication with focused precision that came from knowing exactly what was at stake. She didn't waste motion. Just built what was needed and installed it with steady, careful hands. On the bridge, Voss made coffee. It felt like something to do. Something normal. She carried a cup back to her station and looked at the screen. What's your name? The translator processed, returned something that didn't quite fit into human sound, then adjusted. Savari. Petra Voss. Earth. A pause. Then, you are the ones who were removed. Yeah, Voss said. That's us. The silence settled between them, not uncomfortable. Present in the way silences are when 2 people are sitting with something neither of them needed to say out loud. After a moment, Savari spoke again. 40 years ago, we were removed. Voss looked up. From the council? Yes. No appeal. We filed one. And it is still pending. There was no emphasis. No attempt to make the statement heavier than it already was. Just the fact, delivered with the composure of someone who had learned to carry it. Voss let out a quiet breath. Sounds familiar. Something shifted in Savari's posture then. Subtle. The way stillness changes when something that had been held still relaxes, just slightly. You are beginning, Savari said. You do not yet know how difficult it will be. Voss took a sip of her coffee. Yeah, she said. We're figuring that out. The component finished shortly after. Installed. Power came back online on the other ship, readings shifting from critical to manageable. Before the docking clamps disengaged, a data transfer request came through. Unsecured. Unfiltered. Voss accepted it. Navigation charts filled her screen. Not standard. Not clean. But detailed. Paths through regions her maps labeled as incomplete. Routes that curved through dead zones and hazard areas the Council had never seen a reason to chart. 40 years of movement through space without infrastructure, mapped by a species that had learned to survive without anyone's permission. Voss stared at it for a long moment. Then she nodded, more to herself than anything else. Appreciate it, she said. Savari inclined her head slightly. A gesture the translator rendered as something close to acknowledgement. You made a choice, she said. We remember those. The docking clamps released. The ships separated. One turned back toward its original path. The other continued forward, its route extended by something it hadn't carried before, something that wasn't cargo. As the signal faded, Voss opened a channel. Light speed. Slow. But enough. Made a friend, she said. Sending data. She attached the charts. Then she leaned back and looked at the updated route ahead. It was longer now. More complex. Less certain. But it connected to something it hadn't connected to before, and for the first time since the network went dark, the path forward didn't feel like isolation. It felt like the beginning of something else. It started as notes. Solis hadn't intended to write anything permanent. She had opened the document on the return journey, sometime after the relay network went gray, in that long, quiet stretch of travel that gave too much time to think and nowhere to put the thoughts. At first it was just observations. What had happened? What had failed? where the system had held and where it had shown what it really was. She wrote about the Drev. She wrote about the cave on that moon, about what Dr. Atomy had found there, 11 weeks in the dark with something ancient and patient that communicated through contact, through chemical memory past organism to organism like breath. She wrote about what they had shown her, the sound of drilling, the slow vibration of machines that didn't know they were there and would not have stopped if they had. She wrote about the 4-hour exchange that Atomy had never fully described, except to say they showed her their oldest scar. She wrote about the chamber, about silence, about how many species had sat in those tiered seats and said nothing when it would have cost them almost nothing to ask a question. And then she started writing something else. Not what had gone wrong. What would have to be different? The first sentence took the longest. Not because it was complicated, but because it had to be exact in a way that the rest could not afford not to be. She had spent years reading council documentation, 9,000 pages of it, and she understood what happened to language when it was allowed to be flexible. Every clause that bent had bent toward whoever needed it to bend. Every rule with exceptions had become a map of those exceptions. This couldn't be that. She typed. No member of this agreement may classify another species as non-sentient without independent verification. She stopped. Read it. Removed a word. Added another. Changed the order. Read it again. The problem wasn't writing something that sounded right. The problem was writing something that could not be interpreted into meaning something else without the interpretation being obvious. She kept writing. The capacity for thought is presumed, not demonstrated. The burden of proof rests on the one making the claim, not the one being claimed against. No review may be conducted by any body with active commercial agreements in the zone under examination. No classification may be finalized in under 30 days. No dismissal may stand without published reasoning. Each line built the same way. Simple, direct, specific. No space for interpretation. No space for a committee to spend 40 years deciding whether a living species counted as something worth protecting. She thought of the Drev while she wrote it. She thought of their 48-hour dismissal. She thought of the word inevitable and how the council made things inevitable by ensuring the system could only ever arrive at the outcomes the system preferred. By the time she stopped, there were 11 pages. Not dense, not technical, clear. She didn't call it a treaty, didn't call it a charter. Those words carried weight she didn't want. The weight of permanence, of authority, of structures that inevitably grew too large to understand themselves. This was something smaller, something that required agreement, not enforcement, something that could change if it needed to. She carried those 11 pages for months before showing them to anyone. The first time she did, it wasn't in a chamber. It wasn't formal. It wasn't even entirely planned. She and Savari were sitting in the cargo bay of a ship that had been converted into a meeting room by the addition of a table and 2 chairs, and Solis had simply placed the pages between them. Savari read them in silence. Once, then again, the second time slower. Not just reading what was written, but what wasn't. The shape of the space between the lines. You want to build something, she said. Yes. Not under them. No. Next to them. Solis nodded. Savari's eyes shifted slightly. The small movement Solis had come to understand meant consideration, the way a held breath means consideration. Then, simply, we will sign. No negotiation. No requests for changes. Just a decision made not on advantage, but on recognition. The particular kind of recognition that forms when someone who has been invisible for a long time sees themselves described accurately for the first time. The next meeting took longer. The syndicate did not move quickly. They had spent 80 years navigating the council with the constant awareness that a single misstep could cost them the modest standing they had managed to maintain. Darvik, their senior representative, a being whose stillness under examination felt less like composure and more like patience of geological depth, read the pages with a different kind of attention. Analytical. Every sentence examined not just for what it said, but for what it could be made to say. You are proposing equal standing, he said finally. Yes. One species. One voice. Yes. He looked at her for a long moment. Not looking for sincerity. Looking for something harder to fake. We have been members of the council for 80 years, he said. We have never been treated as members. I know, Solis said. He studied her expression. You read the records, he said. All of them. A pause. Then a small shift in posture. Decision. The syndicate will sign, he said. But not as one. 12 signatures. Individually. A corner of Solis's mouth moved, just slightly. That was going to be my suggestion, she said. The agreement began to take shape. Not as something imposed, as something chosen. Species that had been ignored and minimized and classified, and simply forgotten began to find something in those 11 pages that they had not found anywhere else. Not protection. Solis had been careful never to promise protection. Not advantage. Recognition. The understanding that the system being built would not require someone to be less in order for someone else to be more. The Velnos took the longest. Communication itself was the barrier. Their language moved through water, carried in pressure and sound at frequencies that required entirely new systems to translate even a single sentence correctly. It took months to build those systems. Months of work by people who did not know if any of it would matter. When Solis finally managed a full exchange, sitting beside a tank of temperature-controlled salt water in a ship bay that smelled of brine and ozone, the response wasn't immediate. She waited, long enough that she stopped being sure the message had landed. Then it came. We have been here longer than their rules, the translation said. We remember what they forgot. Solis held the response for a moment, then asked the only question that mattered. Will you sign? Another pause. Not uncertainty. Something that felt, even through translation, like the weight of being asked something that had never been asked before. Then, we have been waiting for something worth signing. By the time the pages were placed on the table in the converted cargo bay, they were no longer just Solis's work. They were something shared, tested, understood, chosen. No ceremony, no speeches, just a sequence of moments, each one marked by a different species stepping forward and leaving something of themselves. A mark, a pressure imprint, a chemical signature that carried not just identity, but meaning. The Drev signed last. Their method required contact. Both hands placed flat against the surface, held still long enough for the transfer to complete. When they stepped back, the document carried something new. A faint scent. Like rain. Like old spaces that had held time. The translator noted that the signature contained more than confirmation. It contained a record. Of the room. Of the light. Of the exact number of species present. Of the moment itself. Preserved the way the Drev preserved everything. Not in text. Not in symbol. But in memory held in the body of the thing that witnessed it. Solis looked at the pages. 11 sheets representing something the Council had never managed to create across 6,000 years of accumulated structure and ceremony. Agreement without hierarchy. Recognition without classification. A system that did not require someone to be less in order for someone else to be more. It was small, fragile, unproven, but it was real. And for the first time since the chamber had gone silent around her, Solis allowed herself to consider something that hadn't seemed possible before. They weren't just surviving. They were changing the rules. The Council did not call it a war. They never would. The term they used was compliance, a controlled action, a corrective measure, a restoration of order in regions that had drifted outside acceptable parameters. It sounded clean. It sounded temporary. It sounded like something that would resolve itself once the appropriate pressure had been applied. The fleet that entered the outer corridor did not look temporary. For heavy-class vessels, 12 patrol cruisers, support ships carrying everything needed to sustain a long-duration operation far from central infrastructure, moving in formation on established routes, following navigational beacons that had guided Council traffic for centuries. Predictable, efficient, documented. OAE watched their approach from the bridge of her flagship, the display in front of her mapping their trajectory against something very different. Not official routes. Not recognized pathways. Lines drawn from data that didn't exist in any Council archive. Savari's charts from 40 years of movement without permission, syndicate trade paths worn smooth by decades of traveling under Council notice, human survey data collected at speeds too slow to matter to anyone who had always relied on relays. 31 systems worth of space the Council had never needed to understand. Until now. They'll try to establish a forward position here, one of her officers said. OAE nodded once. They won't push, she said. They'll wait. She tapped a control, bringing up a secondary overlay. Supply lines. Fuel consumption. Projected resupply intervals based on standard Council operational doctrine. They're not here to fight, she continued. They're here to make a stop. Her finger traced along one of the routes. We make sure they can't afford the patience. There were no speeches, no declarations, just a series of instructions issued with the same calm precision she applied to everything. Target logistics. Avoid direct engagement. Force delays. Increase cost. Make every decision harder than it needed to be. The first encounter happened in a stretch of space that had once been considered unremarkable, a corridor the Council had mapped just enough to move through efficiently, but never deeply enough to understand. The lead cruiser entered expecting to establish position. Instead, its navigation systems began returning conflicting data. Minor discrepancies at first, then enough to require recalibration. 6 hours spent correcting a problem that did not technically exist, burning more fuel than planned and falling behind projected schedule. No damage. No attack. Nothing to file a formal report about except delay. 17 more incidents followed across the first 3 weeks. Communication relays flickering at the edge of functionality. Navigation beacons drifting just enough to require constant adjustment. Supply vessels arriving later than expected, their routes complicated by interference that never lasted long enough to be traced. Each event was small, individually insignificant. Together, they accumulated. Time extended. Fuel consumption increased. Schedules slipped. Nothing catastrophic, just friction. The kind of friction that costs more than it should and provides no clean target to address. OAE ships rarely appeared directly. When they did, it was brief, a sensor contact at the edge of range, a shape moving through a dead zone the Council had no charts for, gone before pursuit could lock. They didn't hold ground, didn't defend positions. They moved, constantly, using routes that bent through space in ways that required knowing the space the way you only know something when you have no other option but to learn it by living inside it. To the Council fleet, it felt like chasing something that refused to exist long enough to be caught. Reports began to change in tone. Unorthodox tactics, unpredictable movement, increased operational cost. The language remained clinical and measured. But the pattern was clear. This was not behaving the way it was supposed to. The operations that had been approved as simple corrections were extending. The budget projections were slipping. The explanations traveling back through layers of command to the political structures that had approved a clean, efficient action were becoming harder to make clean. 3 months in, the fleet reached the edge of a system that didn't appear in any official documentation as strategically significant. Their forward supply line failed to arrive on schedule. Not destroyed, delayed. Rerouted. Forced through a region marked as low priority and never fully charted. By the time it reached the fleet, fuel reserves had dipped below projected thresholds. Operations slowed. Every movement required more calculation, more justification. OAE watched it all unfold in real time. Not with satisfaction. With focus. The Council fleet moved like a system that expected stability. Defined routes. Reliable data. Predictable outcomes. OAE's fleet moved like something that had already accepted instability as the baseline condition. That didn't need perfect information, only enough. That didn't need control, only movement. No decisive battle ever took place. No moment where one side overwhelmed the other. Just a slow shift in the weight of things. Momentum changing direction. Until the question was no longer how the Council would enforce compliance, but how long it would continue trying. Status, OAE asked from the bridge, her voice the same quiet instrument it always was. Council formation holding, her officer replied. But they've reduced forward movement by roughly 40% over the past 2 weeks. She nodded once. Keep them moving. Because that was the point. Not to stop them. Not to destroy them. To make every step cost more than it was worth. And in that space between intention and outcome, to let the advantage shift. Quietly. Steadily. Without permission. The first indication that something had changed did not come from a battlefield. It came from a report that no one had prioritized. Buried in a stack of routine briefings, filtered through layers of administrative sorting, the document had waited 2 weeks before someone read it properly. When they did, the numbers didn't look like a threat. They looked small. 31 systems. 28 species. No central authority. No fixed capital. No standing military. On paper, barely a structure at all. The kind of loose arrangement between marginal entities that usually dissolved under the first real application of pressure. But there were other details. Trade volume that did not align with projected capacity. routes bypassing established corridors entirely, medical advancements not appearing in any licensed database, cargo vessels equipped with defensive systems that had never been formally registered, agreements between species that had not communicated with each other in decades, now conducting regular exchanges in formats the Council's monitoring systems couldn't classify. None of it was impossible. Individually. Together, it formed something the system did not have a category for. Not rebellion. Not alliance. Not competitor. Those implied structures that behaved in familiar ways, that made demands, held ground, sought negotiation. This didn't. This operated alongside the system without relying on it. Independent. Functional. Growing. Quiet. And something else was happening. Minor member species were asking questions. Carefully. Indirectly. Through intermediaries and unofficial channels. What joining this arrangement would involve. What leaving the Council would cost. What alternatives existed if they ever needed them. The answers, when they came back, were simple. No tiers, no combined representation, no classification without independent proof, participation by agreement, and nothing more. It should not have been enough. By every model the Council had used for 6,000 years, systems without enforcement structures and centralized authority and mechanisms for resolving disputes through hierarchy did not hold. They fragmented, collapsed, disappeared. This one didn't. It adapted. Decisions were slower, but they were shared. Conflicts emerged, but they were addressed directly, without waiting for approval from something distant and uninterested. Imperfect, inefficient, messy in ways the Council's architecture had been specifically designed to eliminate. And it held. The compliance action continued because it had to, because stopping would require acknowledging that it should never have started. But the tone of the internal reports shifted. They grew longer, more detailed, less certain. The phrase limited strategic significance stopped appearing, replaced by something more cautious. Evolving structure. The difference was small. It meant everything. 8 months after the initial ban, the Council sent an envoy. Not a fleet. Not a demand. A conversation. He arrived in a vessel small enough to avoid attention, carrying an offer that would have resolved everything if it had been made at the beginning. Suspension reversed. Access restored. Licenses renewed. The incident reclassified and filed somewhere it would not be found by anyone who wasn't already looking. The condition was simple. Return. Reintegrate. Accept the system as it was. OAE listened to the offer in silence. Not interrupting. Not reacting. When it finished, she set her cup down carefully on the table between them. 8 months ago, she said, this would have mattered. The envoy waited. There are 43 cargo vessels in operation that didn't exist before, she continued. 14 colonies still functioning that shouldn't be, not by the projections your system made when you cut us off. 11 medical treatments we can now produce entirely ourselves, without licenses, without permissions, without any system we don't control. She folded her hands lightly. We built routes you don't map, she said. Systems you don't monitor. Agreements you don't control, between species you had decided didn't matter enough to maintain. A pause. Not for effect. For accuracy. We needed your network, she said. We don't anymore. The envoy held her gaze carefully. The review hearing is still scheduled, he said. 40 years from the date of suspension. OAE nodded once. We won't be there. It wasn't defiance. It wasn't anger. Just a statement of something that had quietly become true while no one was watching. In the weeks that followed, more inquiries came. Some quiet, some direct. Species that had never considered leaving began to calculate what staying actually meant, what it cost in ways that didn't appear on the formal ledgers. The Council continued. It still had power and reach and 6,000 years of history on its side. It was still the largest structure in the known galaxy and likely would be for a long time to come. But for the first time in those 6,000 years, it was no longer the only structure that mattered. Somewhere beyond its primary routes, in systems it had never needed to understand, along paths it had never bothered to chart, between species it had classified and dismissed and forgotten, something else was taking shape, not replacing it, not yet, but existing without it. And that, more than any direct conflict, was the thing the Council had never prepared for. Because power had always been defined by control, by access, by the ability to decide who was included and who was not, who counted and who didn't, whose language was worth learning and whose was simply labeled non-sentient and moved past. Now, for the first time, inclusion was no longer required. The door that had been closed 8 months ago had been closed, expecting silence on the other side. Instead, in the quiet of that absence, something had grown. Slowly, steadily, without asking. And in a converted cargo bay somewhere between systems, the 11 pages carrying the signatures of 28 species, including one written in memory and sent, in the imprint of a colony that had once nearly been erased, sat in a sealed case that Solis kept with her the way you keep something you understand the full weight of. Not a weapon, not a shield, a record of what it meant to be recognized, of what it cost to be ignored, of what it looked like when the beings the system had decided didn't matter decided, quietly and without permission, to matter anyway.